I'm assuming that this is a byproduct of the amount of time I've spent writing clean ambient music on the internet, but I actually get a lot of questions on why I don't use effects loops on my amplifiers. And so in this video, I want to go ahead and address that so that I have a link to send people when I get that question. But also along the way, I think we should re-examine that in the first place. But before we get into it, my name is Mark Johnston, this is Secret Weapons, and if this is your first time here, this is a YouTube channel where we do gear demos and reviews as well as studio tips and tricks for leveling up your writing, playing, and recording from the perspective of a guitar player working out of a home studio. If that's the kind of thing that would be interesting to you, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button and stick around for future videos. So let's get into it. So the number one reason I don't use effects loops in my amplifiers is that the majority of amps that I reach for don't actually have a loop in the first place. These are typically going to be more American voiced, low 12 to 18 watt amplifiers, usually combos. The kind of main offenders on this list are going to be my Benson Monarch Plus, my Morgan PR12. They are the kind of go-to amplifiers for me here in the studio, and I never use effects loops because they just don't have them. The irony here is the fact that neither of these amps are what I would consider to be pedal platforms necessarily. They both start to kind of really break up, even with medium output pickups, by about 5 or 6 o'clock on your volume control, and neither of them have a master gain anyways. And yet despite that, the only time I use anything resembling a loop when using those amplifiers is if I'm running something in stereo and I don't want to use a digital amp-in-a-box solution. We'll circle back to that. But for all of that, I have amplifiers that do have loops and I just don't use them. A couple of good examples are I have a Matchless Chieftain here in the studio that has a built-in effects loop, and an amp that I have that has a loop that I love here in the studio, and the amp that we'll be using in this video is the Victory Sheriff right behind me. This is an 18 watt-ish kind of plexi style head, voiced to be pretty clean, but with a lot of gain on tap for when you want it. But even so, I still don't typically use the loop, and there's a couple reasons for that. So let's talk about why I don't use the effects loop on amps even when I have it as an option. Reason number one, and I'm just gonna be fully honest with you here, is I'm kinda lazy. I like to build a pedal board where everything is in line, in series, and I can run my guitar into my board, into the front of an amp. I don't want to go 5-cable method. I don't want to do a bunch of additional kind of long cable routings, nor do I want to have to put the amp and the pedal board close enough together that I can kind of hack together a patch cable solution. Just want to run my pedals into the front of my amplifier so that I can get recording faster. But I promise it's not just laziness. Reason number two is I actually generally really like the sound of effects into the front of an amplifier. I am a big fan of saturation and that slight bit of compression that comes with the saturation that tube amplifiers provide. And for me, this comes in the form of setting my amplifier pretty clean, gain staging into it appropriately so that I'm not destroying the kind of range the amp has, and then working with my wet effects to go into the front of that. I like having my delays and my reverbs, especially in a mono signal chain format, to have a little bit of grit to them, to have a little bit of messed upness that kind of helps them feel more glued into the sound. And if I want a more pristine version of delay and reverb, I can always do that in the box later, or through reamping, or with a solution that we will talk about in a minute. And I think there's a little bit of me that really does appreciate kind of sound design through limitation. Gain in a tube amp can sound great, but I very rarely want my amps to be gained all the way up. I very rarely want that kind of blown out speaker sound from something like my Benson. I think my Benson operates best at edge of breakup. And part of why we're gonna use the Victory in this video is for exactly the reason that it's a plexi style amplifier. They have a very specific kind of amp gain that really works very well. And if I'm running wet effects and I'm not looking for a shoegazy kind of splatter, those sounds are kind of off limits to me in a lot of contexts. So let's go ahead and take our wet effects, which for this video are going to be the new GFI Solus Ventus kind of big box delay and reverb device. It's going to be something that gives us a ton of delay and reverb, and a very pristine sounding kind of delay and reverb. Let's put it into the front of the Victory amplifier kind of set clean, set with a little bit of gain, and hear how those two things sound. We'll then throw it in the loop itself, actually making use of that loop the way the amp was designed to. And then third, we'll do my bonus favorite version of things, which is taking it and putting it in a send built into the microphone preamps that we are using to record our amplifier. In this case, we're going to be using the Meris 440 preamps, which on their face have a built-in send and return. And that has the added benefit, like I alluded to earlier, of being able to split the send of even a mono amplifier into a stereo wet image for recording. So let's go ahead, power up that amp, and give a listen to all three of these contexts and compare and contrast the sounds. Let's find out, am I right about my anti-effects loop prejudice? So we've got everything wired up with the Solus Ventus going into the front of our Victory Amps Deputy. For these sound samples, we're going to use a Lincoln Brewster Signature Strat. And the rationale here is these are some really good medium output single coils that will let us access kind of both the edge of breakup, slightly overdriven and clean aspects of this amplifier, while also having the benefit of a built-in boost circuit in the Strat that gives us a little bit more kind of scream when we want it. And the reason we have that is it just will kind of showcase some of the drawbacks of pushing our wet effects into the amp harder than we otherwise would be able to in this context. So first things first, wet effects bypassed, amp set basically touch responsive edge of breakup, where we can go from this all the way to let's go ahead and turn on our wet effects. So drawbacks and benefits to wet effects in front of the amplifier is you get that cohesive feeling of your wet effects being compressed by the tubes in the amp alongside everything else. The downside is, once again, you can go from these really beautiful adding just that hair of really wonderful grit on our delays and reverbs, but by activating this boost circuit, you can really chew up your reverb way faster than you intend to. Whereas if we take those wet effects out, we have access to let's go ahead ahead and move it to the effects loop. So we've gone ahead and rewired our wet effects into the effects loop on the back of the amplifier. So let's hear kind of how things change with a much cleaner version of our wet effects that are beyond the preamp in this thing, going into the ostensibly the power amp and then out to our cabinets after that. And of course, the big benefit here is the ability to lean into those more overdriven, boosted sounds that really blow up the amp without absolutely ruining your wet effects. But of course, you're still getting gain and breakup in the wet effects because you're feeding into it that way. The biggest benefit in this configuration from the first one, in my opinion, is not so much the difference in the ways that the wet effects get chewed up, but the fact that when you have this in front of the amplifier, if you hit the front of the amp really hard with everything, with that like aggressive high gain thing, and then roll back to something clean, the new signal, the new sounds coming in are still going to chew up because the trails from your wet effects are still hitting the front of that amplifier. Whereas what you just heard, you can do something like this where you can really crank the amp, create a lot of distortion, and then switch back to clean and have the new audio coming in follow in kind, like this. The effects are reacting to whatever the amp is doing, not the other way around. It's obvious, but it's worth noting. And finally, let's take a look at my kind of secret third and favorite way of running wet effects, if not in front of the amplifier itself. And that is not in the effects loop of an amplifier, but rather in the effects loop or the insert of analog hardware preamps. For the purposes of this video, we're using a pair of Meris 440 preamps in my 500 series rack right here. And so right now I have it wired up where my microphone that I'm talking into is using the left channel and my guitars with the aux box have been running into the right channel. What we're going to do for this final set of samples is take that mono send from our aux, rather than sending stereo aux in the first place, but running it mono into the input on this right channel, and then out of the send on the face of the preamp. From there, it'll go into the mono input of the GFI, and then stereo out the back of the GFI into the return on both preamps, giving us access to stereo wet effects, post amplifier, post cabinet, post microphones, basically a completely clean studio quality representation of our wet effects in stereo from a mono amplifier setup. So let's wire that up and let's give it a listen. So listening back to all three sets of sound samples that we've just run through, I think I've effectively made my case for why I'm such a fan of that third configuration. The stereo aspect of it is obviously a huge benefit, but I also really like the kind of cleanliness that you get from placing your wet effects beyond the entire run of the amplifier circuit versus in the loop. The loop sounds great too, but there are different characters to both of them, and if I'm choosing between clean or processed sounding wet effects, I like the idea of choosing all the way before the amp or all the way after the amp. The thing about that third setup though is if you're not somebody who has or uses analog outboard preamps like I do, or if you're somebody who has some preamps but they don't have a loop built into them like that, there are some ways that you can implement a similar workflow for yourself. One of the obvious and simplest ones is if you're somebody who uses something like the Quad Cortex or one of the Line 6 or other brands that makes a kind of all-in-one solution, putting your wet effects at the very end of the chain and something like that, after your amps and after your cabinets and everything, that's a way of implementing a very similar sounding workflow. Or if you're not using hardware gear at all, you could do all of this in the box by recording your guitars directly into your DAW and then using a Neve 1073 style plugin and stereo wet effects in the box. But there are a couple ways to also take these same principles and take them with you both in the studio and live without need for analog rack preamps or access to your plugins in a live context. If you have an amplifier like the Rev D20 or any other amplifier that has its own built-in load where you can send an XLR or a 1/4-inch cable, anything balanced from the back of the amp directly to your PA or your recording interface, you can usually run that kind of thing through your wet effects as well. Something like this that has built-in cabinets will really allow you to do exactly what we did in this video, but without the need for the hardware preamps. Or if you're somebody who is miking something up but wants to use the same kind of principle and the same approach, this is the JHS Color Box, which is basically a Neve 1073 analog preamp in a pedalboard friendly context. And on the input side, you have a jack that will do 1/4 inch or XLR inputs, do all the kind of preamp processing that you could want, and then send out over XLR or 1/4 inch as well, allowing you to plug a microphone, whether it's on your cabinet or your voice or anything, into the front of this, and then run this out to whatever wet effects you want to use as well. If any of these other solutions are something that you would like to see me cover on this channel, let me know in the comments down below, and I would be happy to take a more focused look at any of those configurations as well. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end of this video, please let me know in the comments down below. Number 1, do you use an effects loop? If so, why? If not, why not? If you want to suggest topics for future videos like this, you can leave them as well in the comments down below. Or for an even better shot of me seeing and making a video based on your suggestion, check out my Discord, which is available exclusively to my Patreon supporters. It is a really great, small, tight-knit Discord community. Link down below to join up for that. Thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one.